Steve Bramwell said earlier that he thinks the case for philosophy in schools has been decisively made. That work is done. In one way, I agree with him. I think there are an awful lot of good reasons to think that philosophy should be in the curriculum, and there's an awful lot of good practice out there that makes a powerful case for it. But I'm less optimistic about this case having been adequately and compellingly made. I think it's not clear to a large number of people why philosophy should be added to the school curriculum. And I think those of us who have been championing the cause and indeed practicing in this area have maybe not been as articulate and clear and compelling as we could be about why philosophy should be added to the curriculum. Lots of what you've heard today, I think, helps to remedy that, and I'm going to have a go at remedying it further in what I say this afternoon. My talk's called On the Distinctive Educational Value of Philosophy. I think there's a temptation among defenders of philosophy in schools to talk very generally about we need to teach philosophy because it teaches children how to think. And thinking is really important. We're all on board with improving the quality of people's thinking, so we need philosophy to do that. And I think that's right, but it's problematic too, because of course science teaches you how to think, and mathematics teaches you how to think, and history teaches you how to think. Most of the subjects of the school curriculum are forms of intellectual inquiry that are precisely concerned with how to think well. So I think we have to be a bit more specific about what it is we're claiming that philosophy does that these other subjects don't do, or at least don't do as well or as precisely as philosophy does. Okay, so should philosophy be a compulsory subject in schools? This is what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in it as a sort of optional extra. I think it should definitely be an optional extra, and it should definitely be something you can study at university. What I'm interested in is, can we make a case for philosophy being something that every child ought to study at some point during their compulsory education? Are the benefits conferred by philosophy on those who study it such that it deserves to be considered a universal educational entitlement? That language of entitlement was the language that accompanied the national curriculum on its original launch in 1988. The idea of a national curriculum is that we can identify a core set of learning that we want to say is an entitlement of every child. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking about one of the things that schools should be in the business of, and I'm interested in whether philosophy should be part of that entitlement. I want to make two assumptions that I'm not going to spend too much time arguing for, though I have argued for them elsewhere. The first is that philosophy can be taught to children of all ages in ways that allow them to make genuine progress. So just as fledgling mathematicians begin with arithmetic operations, so fledgling philosophers can start with the meanings of words. It's occasionally suggested that philosophy is just too difficult for children, that philosophy operates at some higher order level, some second order form of inquiry, that until you've got a sort of solid foundation in first order domains, you won't be able to cope with the demands of philosophy. I think that's just not true. My own background is a primary school teacher, and lots of the people in this room have lots of experience of teaching philosophy with very young children, and we can all attest to the fact that it is not the case that children cannot engage perfectly, meaningfully, and competently with these questions, albeit at an age-appropriate level. Of course, they're not making major philosophical breakthroughs, but they are able to see the interest of the question and indeed to make some progress with them. So one very basic thing that philosophers do is try to get clear about what words mean. Often confusion arises in conversation just because we're talking at cross purposes, because we haven't got clear about the concepts we're using. And so just clearing up meanings of words is the sort of work you can begin with children at a really young age. So I think it's possible to teach philosophy for children. I'm not going to spend any more time arguing for that claim. I'm interested in whether it's valuable, whether we should do it. And secondly, that philosophy confers general intellectual benefits on those who study it. So sustained participation in disciplined theoretical inquiry cultivates in children a range of dispositions conducive to the assessment of evidence and the estimation of truth. I'm sure that's true. We definitely want people to have these general thinking qualities. Philosophy definitely cultivates them, but so do a great many other academic subjects. So this gives us a general case for the pursuit of truth in schools, the initiation of children into those forms of inquiry which have truth as their end, but it doesn't give us a specific case for philosophy. So these 2 points, philosophy can be taught to children and there's general educational value in doing so, may not constitute a good enough reason to make philosophy a compulsory school subject. The case for putting philosophy on the curriculum would be stronger if it could be shown that philosophy has some distinctive educational value, a kind of educational value different from and additional to the kind it shares with the other school subjects. Okay, so does it? The problems of philosophy. Philosophers tackle particular kinds of problem and develop particular forms of argument and analysis to solve them. When should we say that problems and the means of tackling them deserve a place on the curriculum? Well, here's a suggestion, and it's not supposed to be an exhaustive suggestion. It's supposed to be one reason that would justify us in putting problems and the means of tackling them on the curriculum. Children should be equipped by their education to deal effectively with at least those problems that feature prominently and pressingly in ordinary human lives. I'm thinking of the sorts of problems that we all encounter, not specialized problems that are encountered by lawyers or by politicians or by people in the military, but general problems that are such that pretty much any human being alive in the world is likely to encounter problems of this nature in the course of their life. This is what I mean by the sorts of problems that arise in ordinary human lives, and problems that seem to demand some sort of answer from us. And because we're talking about a compulsory school subject, something that everybody should study, then I think this is one promising criterion for what might justify us in putting a subject on the curriculum. Okay, but it might be thought, well, hang on a minute, surely it's not the case that philosophical problems feature prominently and pressingly in ordinary human lives. It seems clear that many philosophical problems feature only marginally and inconsequentially in most human lives. Philosophy can look a lot like a pastime of the idle rich. Wrestling with paradoxes and untangling linguistic knots may just be a diverting way for people of leisure to fill the long winter hours. And I think historically, there's been a lot of this in philosophy. There's an awful lot of philosophical work that is concerned with very abstruse and technical matters, and has indeed been a luxury of those who haven't had to go out and do something proper for a living, but have been able to spend their time in this way. So, however, I don't think that matters for the purposes of our argument here, because we only need to show that there is a significant subset of philosophical problems that are prominent and pressing. The school curriculum doesn't have to cover the whole of philosophy. What we need to know is there a bit of philosophy that's important enough and relevant enough to ordinary people's lives that it ought to be covered in school? Okay, so I think there is. I think there is a group of philosophical problems whose significance for everyone is sufficient on its own to warrant the introduction of compulsory philosophy in schools. And these are the problems of justifying subscription to moral, political, and religious standards. So I take it that we all live our lives to some extent governed by norms or rules or standards, prescriptions that we try and hold ourselves to in particular domains, and in particular in the domains of morality, politics, and religion. And insofar as we do that, insofar as we are governed by norms or standards or policies or principles, then we ought to have good reason for those norms and standards. And indeed, we ought to be able to question and revise the standards by which we live our lives in those domains. So one of the things human beings do is hold themselves, and sometimes each other, to standards of conduct. Almost all of us subscribe to moral and political standards of one kind or another, and many of us subscribe to religious standards too. While we typically do not choose the moral, political, and religious standards to which our subscription is cultivated as children, that's to say, I take it that most of us are raised in homes which cultivate certain standards in us before we are able to sort of give any conscious voluntary assent to those things. We are confronted with choices about whether to keep up our subscription to them and whether to add new ones. So it's not that I think we start autonomous and sort of pick our standards from the outset. We're raised with a set of standards, but one of the goals of schooling is to, or ought to be, to enable us to question and revise and reconsider the standards that govern us, in particular in these three domains, or at least it's in these three domains that I think philosophy has a great deal to offer us. So, morality first. There is a long tradition of philosophical reflection on the problem of justifying moral standards, and a substantial repository of philosophical arguments and analyses with which to tackle it. The particular challenge of justifying moral standards is that when we hold ourselves to moral standards, it's not that we're just holding ourselves to some standard. It's not like standards of personal fitness that I may or may not be successful in holding myself to. It's in the nature of morality that we hold not only ourselves but also others to them. So if we subscribe to a standard that prohibits killing people or stealing things or cheating, then we not only think we shouldn't do these things and try to stop ourselves doing them, but we think other people shouldn't do them as well and ought to be in some way sanctioned or reprimanded or punished if they do them. So morality of its nature is very coercive. When we subscribe to moral standards, we are on board with coercing others to comply with the standards we subscribe to. So the problem of justifying moral standards is quite acute. It's not just a matter of personal choice, it's a matter of what we can justify imposing on others. Philosophers are well aware of this and have spent an awful lot of time thinking about it, and so, for example, the contractarian justification for morality shows that the circumstances of justice, rough equality, limited sympathy, and moderate scarcity of resources give us compelling reason to hold ourselves and each other to some basic moral standards. So a number of philosophers, Hobbes and Hume and Rawls and others, have talked about the circumstances of justice. Rough equality, the thought that we are all roughly equal in strength, which isn't to say that some people aren't stronger and some people aren't cleverer, but that we are all such that we are vulnerable to one another. None of us are so much stronger or so much cleverer than the others that we're somehow safe from attack. We are, in that sense, equal. We're all in a domain in which we can inflict harm or pain on one another. Our sympathy is limited, however much we may love some people, and indeed we might manage a bit of love for all people, but we can't consistently and impartially love all others to the same degree. So our sympathy is patchy and limited. And there's a moderate scarcity of resources. There isn't quite enough of all the things everybody wants to go round. And these three factors together bring human beings into conflict with one another and undermine cooperative schemes. The fact that there are things we all want, we don't care equally for the well-being of all others, and we all know that others are vulnerable to attack, gives us some incentive to treat others badly. And so one of the reasons that we have for subscribing to morality, according to the contractarian, is that we need to maintain peace and facilitate cooperation in a way that we just couldn't do without some moral standards in place. Politics too. Politics shares many of the features of morality in that it's coercive. If you vote for a political party and your party gets in, then that government is going to determine what happens to everybody in society, not just you. Similarly, if you favour something becoming a law, then you favour everybody being held to that law. So morality and law and politics both have this coercive feature, so we need to think really hard about the political standards we should subscribe to. And again, philosophy has deep resources on which to draw when wrestling with questions about the political arrangements, principles, policies, or parties we should support. For example, John Rawls's original position argument shows how it's possible for citizens to reach rational agreement on the basic structure of society and principles of political justice by imagining that they're situated behind a veil of ignorance. I'm not going to go into Rawls further at this point for reasons of time. And finally, religion. I also think the ability to think well about the religious standards to which we hold ourselves is really crucial, and again, not nearly enough attention is given to it in schools currently. So finally, philosophers have given a great deal of attention to questions about whether and why those who believe in God should submit to his will. I think it's religious standards here that really matter and not just religious beliefs. In a way, it doesn't matter what you believe is out there. What matters is what you think the implications of what you believe is out there are for how you conduct yourself, how you treat yourself and others in the world. So what matters is the use of religion to justify certain norms or standards of conduct. And here too, philosophers have a lot to offer us. For example, the Euthyphro dilemma shows the emptiness of justificatory appeals to the goodness of God's will. If the things God wills are independently good, says the dilemma, his willing them is irrelevant to their justification. Right? If we have reason anyway to do the things that God tells us to do, then it's the fact that we have reason to do them anyway that matters, not the fact that God's telling us to do them. But if God's willing things is just what makes them good, then their being good gives us no reason to do them, right? If it's just an interpretation, a different way of saying God wills this, then you're still stuck with your question, which is, why should I do what God says I should do? So that's a grasping this point, I think, is a really helpful point for thinking about the coherence of your view about whether and why you should submit yourself to the will of God. Okay, by acquainting children with arguments of these kinds, philosophy equips them with the wherewithal to make intelligent, critical assessments of their own and others' reasons for subscribing to moral, political, and religious standards. Given the unreflective ways in which many children are socialized into moral, political, and religious beliefs and practices, it's important that schools give them the tools to interrogate and revise their standards in these domains. So that's my attempt to identify one distinctive kind of educational value that I think philosophy has. It isn't just that it helps us to think well in the rounds. It's that it helps us to think well about some really pressing and practical obligations that we all have, which is to think carefully about, interrogate, and perhaps revise our moral, political, and religious standards. Thank you.